In an attempt to break out of the shadows, Nash put himself at the forefront of the English response to European surrealism. In 1933, the usually solitary artist took the unusual step of founding a modern art group, Unit 1. In their only show, they exhibited works by some of the established members: Barbara Hepworth, Ben Nicholson, and Henry Moore. Nash contributed a new canvas, Kinetic Feature, and said he wanted the work of the group to express a truly contemporary spirit. But a year after its founding, Unit 1 broke up. Surrealism had become part of Nash's adventure, as he called his life. It spoke to his passion for the mysterious and spiritual, but what he did with it was so personal that he can't really be pigeonholed as a surrealist. He was simply Paul Nash. In 1933, Nash made a trip to Avebury in Wiltshire, where he visited the 4,000-year-old Neolithic site. He was captivated by its mystery and antiquity. He talked in a letter to Margaret of how happy he was in his new world. At this time, Nash had begun to suffer with chronic and sometimes life-threatening asthma. Avebury, which he discovered one hot, dry summer, gave Nash joy as he found he could breathe amongst these mysterious stones. Nobody knows exactly what they are, these great standing stones at Avebury, planted in the landscape like jagged teeth. Are they ancient remains of druidic rituals, prehistoric tomb markers? It's a mystery, but I think that's exactly what drew Paul Nash to them. He could make of these forms what he liked. In his mind, they became ghosts. He imagined them actually moving through the landscape when no one was watching. He was fascinated by their textures, their surfaces, encrusted by time and nature with these shapes, these patterns, these marks of lichen growth, and by their wonderfully suggestive forms. He needed something new. He needed to be reinvigorated. And I think it was the sheer alienness, the foreignness, the weirdness of these forms that inspired him. They gave him a new language, a way of creating his own monuments to his own experience. Nash took the shapes and forms of the Avebury monoliths and made them part of his own teasing pictorial code, transformed them into his ciphers, his hieroglyphs. These stones of ancient origin and ritual significance became, for him, the carriers of other, perhaps more personal meanings. The stone seems to me to have mutated into a shape very much like a human torso, and a rather battered one at that. It's headless, it's legless. There's the curve of its behind, and there's the curve of the back. And what's it made of? The paint has a kind of violence about it that suggests perhaps a bruised skin, but in other places it seems more metallic, like rusting iron, perhaps a memory of the corrugated fencing of the trenches. Some of these shapes might almost evoke mortars or shell holes. So to me it looks very much like a shattered body shaped somehow by conflict. So from an image of peace, tranquility, of spellbinding ancient civilization, he's created a modern image, an image of his own sense of dislocation, of violence, of the destiny of man, perhaps, in the 20th century. This brooding, broken body. From the ghost of the ancient past, he's created an image that suggests the ghosts of war. At about this time, Margaret gave Nash a box camera, and he began to photograph everything he could. Using his new toy like a surrealist's notebook, he captured images as aide-memoire.
inspirations for later work. And in 1935, Nash found himself in a place especially rich in such images. A place which, he said, with its beauty, ugliness, and power to disquiet, had a natural surrealism. The Dorset town of Swanage.
Ah, the joys of the English seaside in the rain. This is number 2, the Parade in Swanage, where Nash stayed. This is his vantage point, a little elevated wrought iron balcony from which you can see the sea wall, the pier, and the town beyond. And what's wonderful about this is that very little has changed since 1935 when Nash first came here. So we can compare what he saw with what he painted. And when we do so, what's striking, I think, is he talked about unrealism or being a seaside surrealist. And when you compare the scene with what he made of it, I think you can really see that, because if I try to take a photograph, I have to be to frame it the way that Nash painted it, I have to go right in and I have to crop like mad, and even then I can only just get a part of it. And I think when you realise how much he altered what he saw, you get a sense of what he was after. He was after essential form, essential rhythm, the energy of the sea, the waves lapping over that great protuberance at the end. Now, what's behind the energy of these images? I think part of the answer may lie in an encounter that took place in 1935, just at the top of that hill, in a hotel that's now no longer there.
In July of that year, in the bar of the Grosvenor Hotel, Nash and his wife were introduced to the beautiful young artist Eileen Agar and her Hungarian husband-to-be, Joseph Bard. Agar was a budding surrealist and excited to meet Nash. Together they went on long walks along the beach, looking for found objects to include in their surrealist experiments. What resulted is some of Nash's most adventurous and unusual work. In this collage, titled Swanage, we have a Nash-painted landscape with surrealist found objects in the foreground. To the right, a large barnacled anchor, which Agar gave to Nash. Their relationship, though, was not restricted to work.
Eileen was very attractive, she was very beautiful, and very flirtatious, I think. It was an immediate attraction on his part. On her part, I'm not quite so sure. I think she was more impressed by the fact that he already had a name, she didn't. He was, since the First World War and his paintings from the First World War, he had quite a name in the London art world, and she didn't then. And I think that was perhaps what attracted her initially.
And what do we know about Nash's health? Because I have the sense that when he met her, his health was already turning bad, and that there's a sense in which his relationship with Eileen is almost like an injection of adrenaline. It's something that gets him going again.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think, you know, if you fall in love, you have a creative energy, don't you? And there's no doubt at all that he had this in a way that perhaps he'd never had before. The amount of paintings, about 80 in the year. Really, it was only just over a year that he was here. So there's no doubt at all in my mind that it was a very creative partnership. Later on, he wrote to her that Margaret, his wife, said, "Oh, Eileen only wants you for sex." And in her book she says, you know, that's not likely. Just look at him, how he was, sick and quite ill all the time, compared to Joseph, who was a very masculine, sort of hairy man. Yeah.
So you think that Nash was genuinely a love affair as well as a...
Oh, yes, I do. I do.
Nash expressed his feelings for Agar in numerous letters. Some of his correspondence with her is still preserved today in the Tate Archive in London.
This really is a very poignant gathering of material, a portrait of an affair in fragments, glimpses and snatches. This is beautiful. Piece of brown braille paper. He'd write on anything he gets hands on. And he's drawn this beautiful picture of Eileen wearing rather risque underwear. Look at her stockings. No suspenders, just tied with a ribbon. And she's got a choker around her neck as well. He's besotted with her at this point. My chaffinch. I can never get off my letters and presents in time. You know, so you won't be surprised that this latecomer bears my love and good wishes. 3 little snakes for you, the practicable one. You will wear, of course. Wonder what he means by that. Then there's this, it's actually an illustration for Thomas Browne's urn burial. It's a hand-coloured lithograph, but he's dedicated it to Eileen. And it's full of the imagery that she loved. Jellyfishes hovering through the air. There's one, perhaps a symbolic representation of her husband as she floats, wide-eyed, through space. A figure seems to be falling down the stairs. It's a dream image of what for Nash seemed like a dream relationship. And by the time he sends this postcard, the affair has become slightly off-on. He's addressing it. He remains with his wife, she remains with her husband. He's addressing it to her under her married name, Mrs. Joseph Bard. And he begins the postcard with a reference to her husband. When I was looking for Joseph's birthday card, I was astonished by this. Don't you think it's rather fine? Oddly alive, as if it might speak. And that's the image itself that he's sent to her. I think Sigmund Freud might have had something to say about that.
During their affair, Agar visited the south of France with some of the famous members of surrealism, including Picasso, Man Ray, and the poet Paul Éluard. Nash discovered that Agar had had a relationship with the married Éluard. Nash angrily challenged Agar, and she tried to break things off with Nash. Nash, though, tried to dissuade her. He didn't want to lose his chaffinch. In a letter he wrote, "If we break now, we break at the peak of our flight, where we had climbed like 2 birds who make love in mid-air, heedless of where they soar. We have not yet taken down our bright sky." But she'd already begun to move away from him. With the outbreak of World War II in 1939, Nash found a renewed patriotism. He wrote of his desire to use his art and imagination as a weapon to beat the Nazis. Nash was appointed a war artist for the 2nd time in his life. And the War Artists Advisory Committee considered Nash's visionary work to suit him for the Air Ministry. Nash himself was desperate to fly. He'd moved with his ever-supportive wife, Margaret, to Oxford, where he'd watch Allied bombers group in the skies above. Nash had loved the idea of flight since childhood. His autobiography opens with the rapturous description of a recurring boyhood dream of being able to fly or somehow levitate. A spring from the ground would carry me up and onward, twirling at times like a leaf on the still air, but always able just sufficiently to steer course. All my life I've enjoyed this mysterious, exciting experience,